Hello, hello. Hi. Hi, can everybody hear me? Thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate you sticking it out with us while we get these audio things figured out. I wanted to introduce to you Ashlee Benge. She is the Director of Threat Advocacy at Reversing Labs, and she's going to be presenting her talk, The Ghost in the Voting Machine. So everybody give it up for Ashlee Benge.
Hi guys, I am going to try to talk really loud so that you can actually hear me, but if you can't hear me, just like wave or give me a thumbs down or something. So my name is Ashlee Benge. I am very fortunate to lead a very cool team of threat researchers at Reversing Labs. In my career, I've worked in roles in threat detection, threat hunting, and now finally I'm in mostly more of an outreach type of role. So today I am going to talk to you a little bit about a recent engagement that we had at Reversing Labs that allowed us to really learn a lot about our posture on election security and more specifically software supply chain security. And so I'm going to start this with a story. In this story, one particular US state had engaged with a contracting company and signed a multi-million-dollar deal, and they were looking to build some back-end infrastructure for their election systems. So this was a reputable contractor. This wasn't a random one off the street. This one had been vetted. They had worked with vital records databases before, and they had really been a good partner to work with up until this point. The tricky part, or the catch to this, is that in that contract it specified that it was okay for this contractor to use foreign nationals as long as they were based in the United States. But then we had a pandemic, and that changed a lot of things, and a lot of those foreign nationals actually moved back to their country of origin to be with their families, to be closer to friends and loved ones, for whatever reason. But that wasn't something that this contractor had thought to report back to the state. And so in this case, we have a broken contract for a huge dollar amount, and this isn't ideal. There are a couple reasons that we don't want this to become an issue. And if we break the contract, this is probably something that is going to hit the news. And now we have a potential publicity issue to deal with, and this was immediately before a midterm election. And so I obviously don't want to rely on chance and hope that something bigger and badder comes up and sweeps that under the rug. And so what the state was really looking for is a way to work this out, because the contractor had, up until that point, been great to work with. And so this is where Reversing Labs comes in. We are mostly a company that does malware analytics and file analysis, so this is our bread and butter. And what we wanted to look for was any other issues outside of just the foreign national contracting issue that might potentially come up as an issue later on in this process. And so as we analyzed this file, or rather this package, the software, we found two main issues that were related to both third-party dependencies. And so in the first case, there was an issue with dependency on a third-party library that is actually maintained by a known felon. And so this is not a great look. At the initial instance when they had started to use this library, the person behind it was not a felon, but there was an unfortunate run-in with the law when this person actually killed someone on their motorcycle. And later on really just did not have a lot of empathy towards the situation. And so all these things combined, not a great library to be using. The second major issue was an issue with callouts to foreign TLDs. And so this is probably more of an issue than you might think it would be, particularly with political tensions in certain regions between the US and other nations. And so the second library that was being used made these callouts. And in addition to the bad look being there to begin with, there's also a potential risk that logs could actually be put somewhere for that foreign entity to access. And so sort of a double issue there. So through engaging with this state and working through these issues with this contractor, we bucketed what we found into two or three rather categories of risk. The first one is financial risk. That's obviously not a good thing to be wasting tax dollars, especially in the multiple millions. It's a bad look, usually causes some sort of political press issue. The second one I also probably don't have to speak very long about, political risk. If you're an election official and you are responsible for trying to procure infrastructure, that can't be used. It's a bad look. It's a bad look if the infrastructure you procure is ultimately calling out to foreign TLDs. Regardless of this, this could potentially have risk for you as an individual trying to get reelected in your state or local government body. The final one I think is the most interesting and the most nuanced, and that is the risk in terms of public relations. And so there have been, and I don't think this is going to be news to anyone, but there have been lots of conspiracy theories, particularly around the most recent 2020 election. And something that I found very interesting was the impact that actually had to the company Dominion Voting that was sort of at the center of a lot of these conspiracies. And so in that case, if you don't remember, one of the accusations was that they were involved with Venezuela, who was changing votes to be for the other party. And this actually did have a very quantifiable financial risk. There was a lawsuit, I think it came out to be filed for just under $1 billion. And so this also, in addition to that, caused a lot of states and other agencies to actually pull back from their potential vetting of using those systems. And so regardless of which one of these categories each of these risks fell into, all of these are fairly concerning. So something that we've talked about a lot today, if you have sat through any of the talks or panels, is this idea of trust and the democratic process. And so something I think we've focused a lot on that we're actually moving away from in terms of election security is this idea of active exploitation, of needing to secure these devices. And that is, of course, the very interesting kind of sexy way to frame the problem. But more and more, I think we're starting to see that it is not only the actual devices that can be exploited, but human beings. And I think we see this the most with the way the trust in our democratic process has started to be poked at by certain bodies that have a vetted interest in undermining that trust. And so I think the most important tie-in to software supply chain security, which is sort of my jam, that's what my research team does, is that the software supply chain actually offers would-be threat actors, would-be bad actors, a potential to compromise one thing that might actually be a little easier to compromise than actual election infrastructure or something touching those systems that are usually very well protected. But if instead they could maybe slip something into that third-party library, a piece of malware or other code that might gather a little information, send that back to the C2 server. If they do that and they're able to get this picked up and used by a number of other agencies that might have sensitive information, then as a bad guy, I've written one piece of bad code, I've put it one place, and I've managed to compromise multiple other entities, which is great value for my time. And I think that's what all of us want, right? Is a good return on our investment. And I think we can see the impact of this if we look at recent instances where we've actually seen software supply chain events. Most recently, the MoveIt instance comes to mind. We've also seen this happen with 3CX, a number of others, SolarWinds, the breach of MEDOC. And in all of these cases, it was only the thing that was being dispersed to customers that had to be compromised rather than the customers themselves. And the enormous financial impact in particular of SolarWinds and also of the MEDOC compromise is very obvious. And so in particular, when we talk about elections, this makes me very nervous. And I'm a nervous person in general, working in threat research, but I think it's particularly concerning that not only is this not active exploitation, which has been given a lot of active attention, we've spent a lot of time talking about that, this is something that might slip by the wayside. It's very easy if you're a developer to fat finger the name of a third-party library and accidentally import something that you didn't mean to import. And what we do at Reversing Labs in my threat research organization is we look at a lot of these libraries and try to uncover the malicious code or malware that's in them. And we find a really concerning amount of malware and other malicious things in these third-party libraries. We often see, it may not even be a typo. It may be that I'm going to name something really close to an existing library that's used all the time. There are many other very simple attack vectors for me to take advantage of if I'm a bad actor. And it's the simplicity that makes me the most worried, because you don't even really have to be that good of a bad guy to cause an issue. And so when we think about potential repercussions for elections, it doesn't even have to be the big, bad, scary nation-state actor that has the technical prowess and time to invest into that. It could just be an individual who has a little bit of knowledge and is able to slip something into a library they know is going to be used. And that makes me really worried that one individual with an agenda would be able to manipulate the public opinion of an election. And so if I had to come up with a takeaway for the audience, I think a lot of what we have focused on in the security product world, and if you're someone who is buying software for critical systems, probably what you're doing is reviewing source code, and that's great. It's really, really important to do that. It's valuable for sure. But if you aren't looking at that final compiled binary, that's a problem, and it's something that you should be very worried about. And so a lot of what we see, particularly, for example, the recent 3CX compromise, is that it was actually during the build process, which you wouldn't have seen if you were just vetting source code, that we saw the malicious library actually introduced. And so this wasn't anything that necessarily would have been caught otherwise, and for that reason, that's very concerning. And so when I think about the ways that I want to see election security change, I think that not only do I want to see time invested into preventing active exploitation, preventing misinformation campaigns. These are all very, very important things. But what I'd also like to see is that we're very conscious of the little things, the things that might not require such skill or the ability to control and get a very massive disinformation campaign going. And so if I had to leave you with a message, I would say if you are someone who is in the business of procuring software, or you are an election official in your state, you should probably think about what your security controls are actually doing. And just as a side note, if I go back to that case study, it was a little bit interesting. We actually ended up reviewing a second application that this government entity was using. And this one was something that was storing vital records in the form of driver's license information. And we actually found an additional instance involving third-party libraries where enough had occurred that there were actually arrests made. And so, I think it's a proof point there that, if you aren't very, very diligent and paying attention, then potentially something could be going on that you're not even aware of. And so with that, I'll stop talking now. If you have any questions, there are people, I'm sure, in the audience that have very interesting points of view. If you have anything to bring up for discussion, happy to hear it. Go ahead, Paul.
How do you know what my name is?
You have to yell at me.
Is there any evidence that the vendors themselves, because there's a small number of vendors who make the hardware and software for election systems, are attuned to this supply chain risk and taking any steps or measures to address it?
Yeah, I think in general, the awareness level is increasing, especially if you're a government entity, because there have been executive orders, for example, that are starting to require things like SBOMs. If you're not familiar, this is sort of like a nutrition facts label for a piece of software. And so there are, I think, positives and negatives to that legislation. That legislation is not very specific, but it does exist, and I think that's a step in the right direction for sure. But I would say in general, the level of awareness sort of starts with those most critical contractors, developers, people who might be touching that sort of very sensitive information, and it's sort of trickled down for there. So I'm hopeful.
Hey, so your firm researches and finds compromised libraries. So is there an authoritative source for those compromised libraries that you'd recommend? Who is that?
Sorry, you said a what source?
Like a source to identify those libraries that have been compromised. Where do we get that information?
Like about the libraries themselves, or who is behind it?
The
Oh,
libraries
okay, gotcha,
themselves.
gotcha. Yeah, so that's something my research team prides themselves on. We, and I think most security research groups in the world, are very serious about spreading that kind of information widely. So we put all that on our blog, actually. We have, we go from very high overviews all the way down into the deep technical details of these sort of threats. And we also obviously provide indicators for free as well. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, we try to publish as much as we can to the general public.
As a security person, how do we... As a security person myself, how do we hold our local officials really responsible for doing the right thing? Because they're gonna look at their money and say, okay, it's not in the budget to do static analysis, dynamic analysis, SBOM. They're not going to do that. So how do we really start at the ground level, at the grassroots level, hold our local authorities responsible for this? Now, I would love to hear your take, because you play in this space a lot more than I'm a healthcare guy, so
That's okay.
That's okay.
My answer might be a little different than you're looking for, but in my point of view, it's really, really important that younger people with more technical prowess, not to disparage anyone who is more senior, but I think a lot of apathy exists, especially in millennials and down. There's just not a lot of involvement in the political system, especially at the local level, and that really bums me out, because local politics is probably most applicable to our lives versus the big national politics. And so we had a lot of urging people to go become poll workers before, but even if you can run for your local city council, if you have the time for that, if you can otherwise do any kind of volunteer work, I think getting people who know and have firsthand experience with the issue into positions of power where they have a voice is going to be most critical to that. I don't know if that's what you were going for, but
It helps a little bit, yeah, for sure. I mean, because so many people are not technical.
right.
So thank you very much.
I don't know if we have time for one more question.
All right. Make the guy with the cane come over to you.
Hello. So I was just wondering if the nation's current political apathy could create kind of a worsening effect of the effects that you mentioned, such as the political risk or public relations at risk. If we're seeing a lot of people in America, especially young people such as myself, my group is starting to have a lot of political apathy. So do you think that could potentially change how people view this issue?
Yeah, I do. One of the things I'm most concerned with is because there's been such a division of our political system, and there are very strong feelings on both sides, I think it's become a politicized issue to even question election security, and that's a problem, because I think it's important to be able to question everything. I think with regards to apathy in general, it's concerning to me that those who find themselves feeling apathetic are usually the people that are sort of in the middle, which I think represents most folks. And it's the very extreme points of view, the sometimes dangerous points of view, that are involved and are willing enough to invest the time to potentially do something of the lines of supply chain threat that's going to ultimately impact critical infrastructure. So it does have me worried, and I think one of the best things that has come out of things like social media and people being very sort of ethically active, if you will, I don't know if that's the right word, but a lot of people, especially who are younger, feel very compelled to stand up for a cause. And so I have hope that the younger generations are going to pick this as a cause that they can really get behind. And the people that I talk to, maybe I'm biased because I talk to mostly very smart people, but I have a lot of hope in that regard.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Ashlee again.
Thank you very much for your time.